the readings with the course coordinator. I'll check up with her today again, but it should be uploaded within a day or two. So in case you don't have it, do let me or let her know. I mean, Akansha, but you can let me know and I can follow up with her. Because I don't have access to the courses website, website. So I can't upload it myself. Okay, all right. So we were looking at some of the important concepts in economics. So we had already talked about the gross domestic product, the different ways of calculating gross domestic product, and we looked at how we compare gross domestic product across time and overseas. And we also looked at the major shortcomings of GDP as an indicator of welfare. And then we had talked about employment and unemployment. This is where we had finished discussing employment and unemployment. And the main point that I ended with is that although unemployment rates have been used in advanced economies to understand if the labor market is functioning well or not, and the idea being that if you have a higher than expected or higher than permissible unemployment rate, it means that there's some sort of an economic distress in that particular context. But then I also tried to explain why the way unemployment rate is defined, and also because it's only in richer, advanced, first world countries that you have some form of unemployment benefits available. That is, the government pays you to sustain yourself when you are unemployed. And therefore, if individuals are not able to get employment that they find suitable in accordance with their expectation, their skill levels, education levels, etc., then they can choose, at least for some time, to be unemployed. And therefore, if you see a higher than expected rate of unemployment, you, as a policymaker, as the government, would or should be warned that there's something that's not working in the labor market. The problem in case of poorer countries like ours is that here unemployment rates indicate very little in terms of the real kind of distress or crisis in the labor market, because there are only few among the workforce who can afford to be unemployed for any non-negligible period of time, because there is no provision of unemployment benefits. So in order to survive, most poor people would just work anyway in whatever capacity, getting paid as little as they get. So just because, let's say in India or in Bangladesh or in Kenya, the unemployment rate seems to be quite low, it doesn't mean everybody who is employed well, employed with a decent quality of livelihood that comes out of it.
Hello.
Second, last but one bench,
हाँ भैया,
can you please stop
ठीक है भैया।
discussing whatever you are? Okay, so that's why unemployment rate is not a very good indicator of economic distress in a poor country, and one will have to then look for other kinds of indicators like income levels, wage rates, conditions of work, maybe hours of work, kind of benefits, etc. So just because you're employed doesn't mean you are in a good shape economically in countries like ours. So that's what I really wanted to. I had already said this, but I just wanted to reiterate it at the beginning of today's class. I now move on to another important concept which we have encountered in our other discussions, but that of inflation. Everybody knows about inflation. We talk about it all the time. Let's start by simply defining inflation. So it's essentially inflation is a phenomenon of sustained increase in general price levels. General price levels, you can think of general price level as some sort of an index or average of all prices. Because there are innumerable commodities being exchanged in any big economy, and therefore there are innumerable prices. So general price level is some sort of a weighted index of all prices. And when there is a sustained increase in this average price level or general price level, you say that the economy is undergoing inflation. It's typically measured using a general price index or consumer price index with a specific base year. So the standard definition of inflation will be the general price level or price index in year T, or let's actually follow the custom that we were using, the current year as a superscript and the base year as subscript. So let's just call the base year B minus PT minus 1 with the same base year over so essentially it's the percentage change in the general price level compared to the last year, where both the price levels pertain to the same base. Right? So one can think of, so this is the inflation rate in year T with respect to B as the base period. So if I put specific numbers, inflation rate in 2024 with, let's say, 1990 as the base is P of 2024 with 1990 as base minus P of 2023 with the same 1990 as base over explain it ultimately in percentage. Because otherwise there has to be a sense of just absolute prices with respect to, like, absolute prices today versus absolute prices yesterday. Last year is possible. The only thing is that the base year kind of gives you a clear sense that we are keeping the consumption basket, the price index is the same price index. Like the average price, you are calculating using the same basket of commodities. Yeah? I mean, otherwise, if you can stick to it, you can potentially, it would not be very different. So here if you're working in terms of indices, that's how it's typically done. But you should get the same number if you're actually working with the absolute price average. As long as you're averaging across the same set of goods.
6, 7.
Uh, it shouldn't
6,
affect
7,
it
6, 7
very
दो बार
much. But in reality, of course, there might be
4-0.
slight differences. But it shouldn't affect because you are trying to capture what's the difference between last year and this year. The base is just there to keep the calculation, sort of the basis of calculation remains the same. That's your main reason for keeping a base year. So if you change it to 2003 as the base year, it shouldn't change much. I mean, it may not be exactly the same for a variety of reasons, but in effect, it should be the same.
हाँ भैया 4, 5, 5.
Yeah, that because they might have a price index series which are corresponding to their own base year, which is okay because it doesn't come in the way of when I'm comparing the inflation rate of. I mean, I don't even need to put 1990 there. It's just there because I just want to make clear that there's a base year at the back of this calculation. But if this is inflation rate for India with 1990 as base and Nepal has 2003 as base, it should be fine. It's comparable. Yes. PET, I mean, there's no formula. It's an index. It's an average price index. So it's some sort of average of all prices in the economy, all prices that you consider are important, because there are literally so many prices. So it's some sort of a weighted average. How is it different from? Because that entire, it's defined as an index, which is, I mean, so basically PET is defined as 100. I mean, it's a scaling parameter basically. So that the base year index is normalized to 100. And therefore, compared to that, if you see your PTB is 200, then it's easier to interpret. It's not the absolute prices that we are notifying here. We are trying to see how the average prices have changed with respect to the base year, where the definition is that the base year prices, the index for the base year is normalized to 100. That is by definition 100. So compared to that, where are you? So if I say 146, it's easier for me to say that in Th period or Th year, there's a 46% increase in general prices compared to the base year. It's just a matter of convenience in expressing it in terms of base year levels. And base year being normalized to 1 or essentially 100 because in percentage terms. Yes? Different countries? I mean, countries.
You said that the parameters used for calculating the price in different countries are different. So say for example, a lot of countries apply to the IMF or the World Bank for a bailout. So say they only give you a bailout if their inflation is under a particular.
Yeah.
If your parameters are different,
Yeah, the parameters are different, hopefully for a good reason. In the sense, if I'm comparing, let's say, a small island country like Fiji versus China, right? The idea being that the commodities which are important, the basket, so where can the differences be? The basket of commodities whose prices are taken into account to calculate the average might differ, because the important commodity basket might be different in Fiji compared to China. And secondly, the weight of those commodities might differ between China and Fiji. So if you are using, so in that sense, the calculation or the parameters are different. But if it's done well, one can actually make the claim that the Fiji index is the more appropriate one for Fiji because it has taken into account the actual spending patterns where Fijians actually spend their money on, which is different than what it is for Chinese. And that's why the parameters, basically these are two parameters where there will be differences. Which prices are important? Because it can't possibly be absolutely exhaustive. There are literally hundreds and thousands of prices which are somewhat important. No, because what you are trying to capture is to what is the extent of yeah.
In India, inflation is always rise up whenever the price of petroleum goes up.
Right.
Right. So I mean, if you place X amount of emphasis on petroleum in India,
Yeah, but why am I? We are not doing it arbitrarily. It should be based on. Suppose I put more emphasis in the Indian calculation of the price index on petroleum compared to in Fiji. It should be based on the fact that Fijians on an average spend much less. Their relative demand of petroleum is much less than that in India. That's the only basis on which I can have a different weightage pattern of petroleum in India versus Fiji. So ultimately what you're trying to capture is what is the extent of change in general average price levels for Fijians compared to Indians. So it's kind of foolhardy to say no. Not only do I have to have the same basket of commodities whose prices will be taken into account, and their weightage has to be also the same. Because Fijians may not have a similar weightage of different commodities in their consumption as Indians do. Because what I'm trying to get at is what is happening to general prices in Fiji versus India. Yeah? Okay, so this is how inflation is measured. Now, let's come to the next issue here, which is the so-called Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is actually an empirical relationship between these two concepts and two phenomena actually also of inflation and unemployment. And it's called Phillips curve because this relationship was identified by somebody called Phillips from New Zealand way back in the 1950s. And the idea of the Phillips curve is the following. So, and this is to start with an empirical regularity or empirical pattern that was identified by this gentleman looking at data actually from the UK at that time. And then this kind of a broad pattern was also seen to hold true for several other countries, and therefore by the early 1960s this Phillips curve relationship was taken as almost a given in macroeconomics. Now what does it imply essentially? If I have an employment rate along the x-axis and inflation rate along the other axis, you're supposed to have some sort of a negatively sloped curve which indicates or shows the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. The trade-off in the following sense, that if you start from this point with a given inflation, I0, and a given unemployment, and you try to reduce inflation to I1, you will end up increasing unemployment to something like U1. So it's called a trade-off because both these phenomena are bad or undesirable phenomena, right? I mean, typically no government would like more inflation, neither would they like more unemployment, right? Ideally, governments would try to reduce both. And what this is telling you is that you can't have the best of both worlds. If you try to reduce one, you will end up through the working of the system, and we'll talk a little bit about why do we have the possibility of such a trade-off holding, like what is the theoretical basis of such a relationship. Remember again that, yeah, I'll come to that. So, just to remind you that the original Phillips curve and much of the initial research on Phillips curve was empirical. So, this was a regularity that was seen for a country if you take different points in time and look at their inflation, unemployment combination. If you study the inflation, unemployment rates at a given point in time, and across time, if you look at it, you tended to get something like this downward sloping curve, indicating this trade-off. Now comes the obvious question that why would you expect this to happen? Now, much of this why question was explained, or economists tried to explain this why question in a way to give some sensible explanation to what we are seeing empirically. So it was not the other way around, that there was an economic theory which talked about such a trade-off, and then we also got to verify it through real life data. In terms of the history, it's the real life data and the pattern that was sort of established first, and people were then exposed trying to give some sort of a explanation to why might it hold. Yeah? So that means that the theoretical basis has always been a bit unsure. Now, what typically was thought to be true from the perspective of the government, because remember, both these variables are ones on which government policy can have an effect to start with. And typically, what governments can do to deal with either inflation or unemployment is to reduce, as somebody is saying, reduce or increase, that's how they do it typically, the interest rates, but what they're trying to do is reduce or increase the aggregate demand in the economy. And the typical instrument through which they do it is by changing the interest rates. This is also called government monetary policy. Now, whether you are going to reduce or increase the aggregate demand, and therefore which way you are going to change the interest rate, depends on which is your initial or immediate goal. Like which of these two bads or these two undesirable outcomes do you want to tackle? Which is sort of driving your policy. Now let's think of first, suppose, in fact, let's make two cases out of it. Case one, you or unemployment is very high. Unemployment is very high. Now, how do you understand this? As yeah. Yeah, because but it's actually all interest rates, because that's the first point through which the government starts its policy by changing the rate of interest the central bank charges to the commercial banks. And that change, or the direction of change, trickles down into all other interest rates. So,
A lot, especially in an uncertain economy, a lot of smaller banks, they just deposit their money in RBI bonds. So if the RBI bonds have like a certain X amount of interest rate, then smaller banks don't take unnecessary risk.
that's true. That's true. But the fact is that all commercial banks, yes, a part of their holdings might be in RBI or central bank bonds, and that is assured return, so that may not affect the way they should ideally behave. But the point is, all commercial banks have a certain part of their, it's called, I think, there's a particular ratio, a particular part of their deposits have to be kept with the central bank by law. So essentially, it's a sort of chain effect. Invariably what happens is, when the government, the government doesn't even need to sort of tell all banks that from now on you charge less. All you need to do is to reduce the rate of interest that it's the repo rate or whatever, you are charging central banks, commercial banks. And invariably, what you are never sure is, if I reduce the interest rate that I am charging, that the government is charging, by 0.5%, all interest rates in the economy will also reduce by exactly 0.5%. That may not happen. But the direction of change, invariably, there's never a non-effect in any interest rate. This is the lending rate of, yeah, you can think of, so basically all interest rates, all rates of interest can be moved in the same direction by the government indirectly by changing the repo rate. What you don't know is that if the government changes the repo rate by 0.5%, HDFC's home loan will also come down by exactly 0.5%. That you don't know because there are some other factors, but the direction of change is always the same. If the government reduces the main rate of interest, all interest rates come down, and the other way around. So if unemployment is very high, the deduction from the government's perspective is that there is not enough demand in the market to generate enough jobs. So the government therefore plans to add to aggregate demand. So the sort of inference, if unemployment is very high, is that aggregate demand is low. So this implies government decides to reduce interest rate. And here I'm just writing interest rate, but actually it's a particular interest rate that the government has direct control over. But it doesn't matter because all interest will come down if the government starts by reducing its repo rate. So government decides to reduce interest rate. The expectation is that investment will increase. Why? Because investors will have cheaper access to funds. Investment will increase, and that will ultimately increase, number one, aggregate demand, but ultimately what you expect is that output or GDP will increase, and this will lead to a fall in unemployment. Because in order to produce more output, obviously you will need to hire more people. But the problem is, if you assume that the initial economy was at a position where all, the entire productive capacity has been used up, that already the output was at a level where all productive capacity, like the machines, the factories, etc., were entirely used up, and you have tried to push the demand beyond that point, right? Another unintended, so this part looks absolutely fine. The government wanted to reduce unemployment, and it seems they have managed to reduce it as well. But another part of this process is that this will also lead to increase of demand beyond what the capacity of the economy to supply. All machines, all means of production were already fully used up, other than labor. Now when I'm trying to increase demand beyond that point, what will happen is that there will be excess demand in the system. It all depends on where you are starting from. There will be excess demand in the system, and the economy will not be able to immediately change its supply or increase its supply to meet the demand. And that will lead to inflation. But see, even that will ultimately have an upward push on the demand, because after employment, but they will also, their demand will get added to the total demand that was there. So the same sort of a problem can potentially happen whichever way you want to increase aggregate demand. Here it's monetary policy, that's called fiscal policy, where you give employment, create employment, give transfers even to poor people. What will they do with that? They will increase their demand. And one is obviously not immediately talking about the slope of this curve, right? All we are saying is that there is potential of some trade-off. Yeah, so let's come to that, right? That this, yeah, so the problem is, this is what I'm saying right after that, that this actually, there was a period, late 50s to early 70s, when the Phillips-Card relationship was seen to hold true in most developed countries. I mean, there were multiple sort of rounds of evidence which seemed to indicate that yes, this kind of a trade-off holds. The main reason why the trade-off was seen to hold is because these countries were operating very near the full employment level. Full employment level meaning the entire productive capacity was getting used at any point in time. Once you start from that point, it's easy to see how when you try to create more demand, it generates inflation. Because the system is not able to immediately supply more. And remember, this was also a time where the extent of global linkages were much lower. So you are operating not in a closed economy, but not also in the kind of globalized economy where you are now, that you're not able to depend on the productive capacity of a large part of the world. China is not there in the same way, let's say, for the US. That if there is an increase in demand, I can tomorrow bring in more supply. If not tomorrow, like in a few days. So you are essentially thinking about how can I increase supply very quickly from within my economy, because your ability to import quickly, the supply lines are not that developed. So immediately, at the first instance, as soon as the demand picks up, what you see is an increase in prices. That might eventually come down if you give it more time, by which time you're either increasing the capacity to supply more, or you have enough time to establish the supply lines to bring in food or whatever from other parts of the world to kind of deal with that excess. But, yeah, just one thing. But this entire thing broke down from the 70s, and the primary sort of episode which led to the demise of the Phillips curve idea was this period of the oil crisis in the first oil crisis in 73, 74, when the Middle Eastern countries, oil-producing countries, got together as a cartel and, literally overnight increase oil prices significantly. And this is the time when you end up seeing something which shows the violation of this sort of a trade-off, this episode of so-called stagflation, where economic stagnation, so it's two bads happening at the same time. The economy is in a recession, as well as in a situation where inflation is high, or inflation is going up, or prices are going up. So which brings down the Phillips curve trade-off relation. Yes, what was your question?
Say the Fed funds interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a lot of ECA to get a lot of cheap money on credit, and say they invest it in other foreign markets. So how does the local market benefit? So even that not the avoided.
It depends, yeah. I mean, if the capital markets are completely unhindered, like people can take their money anywhere they want, raise money from country A and invest it anywhere in the world, yeah, if your investors are not interested in putting money in your country and your government has no means of forcing them, at least partially, to do that, then you can potentially have a situation where monetary policy doesn't work at all. You take cheap funds and take it somewhere else. But capital markets are never, I mean, you're sitting in the second bench, you're looking at your phone, you're talking. What is the point? You've done your attendance, so just leave. Just leave. Yeah, so coming back to what I was saying, that but capital markets are seldom completely without any regulation or without any sort of government intervention. That's very, very rare. Completely open capital markets. Markets can be more open in country A than country B, and overall capital markets have become more liberalized in the last 30, 35 years. But yeah, that's not, I mean, the extent of the effect of monetary policy can surely come down, because a part of the money can definitely leak out to other parts of the world. That happens. Because
You look that the world has a closed system.
Yeah, but there is no such curve that you can, I mean, there's no point in even thinking of that curve. I don't even know if people have done something like that, because it's incredibly complicated to think of global output and global prices at the same time. Yeah, I mean, you can possibly, unless, but which is very likely to hold true, there are certain pockets of um, unused productive capacity in some parts of the world. Then you can quickly increase production when demand increases. So, if you also, I mean, you do this at the level of the global economy, and you also assume that there is full utilization of productive capacity across the world.
When you sign MOUs to increase your FDI, then the system
What are we trying to do?
for example, say at summit like Davos, where you have like world leaders from
Yeah, but Davos doesn't get into trade negotiations. People talk about things. Yeah.
Informal stuff,
Yeah.
good signal, say like you get like $10 billion from country A to country B, etc. So this is what the curve would end up signaling.
I'm not so sure that the curve will automatically end up signaling that, because for particular bilaterals, I mean, for two countries taken together, you might have the curve for those two countries. But firstly, the world never comes together to sign any MOU. And secondly, as I said, it's highly, highly unlikely that productive capacity across the world is always at 100%. That's never the case. Yes? Low meaning no, not, I mean, there's low, high doesn't have much sense. It was at a particular level for which unemployment was unacceptably high. I mean, it was higher than what you wanted. That's, and there is no, it's not a pre-given threshold. I mean, for a certain country, for a certain political group who is ruling, they might say even a 5% unemployment is unacceptable. So it's not like there is a well agreed upon level of unemployment which is seen as too high or too low. So all I'm saying is, starting from a certain demand where unemployment is considered to be high, so that the government thinks they should try to bring it down. This is what is going to happen. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, but generally, for a country as a whole, this is what, remember, you are trying to give an ex post explanation to an empirical pattern that was seen. Then nobody is claiming that it has to happen at all times. When you see it happening, this is one way you can understand why it is happening. Yeah, I mean, or in other words of putting it as a tautology, if it overshoots, then you will have this kind of trade-off. Otherwise, you won't. Yeah, if the system is able to manage that extra demand without having to increase prices, then it will be fine. There should not be any pressure on prices. So there are actually a lot of new developments in how this relationship between the Phillips curve relationship has been studied later, once the original Phillips curve thing broke down from the early to mid 70s. Now people have brought in the role of expectation. So there's something called the expectation augmented Phillips curve, which tends to, once you are able to incorporate the role of expectation, it seems to function better. But obviously that's for other classes. No, expectations of economic agents to what the government is planning to do. Yeah. It's quite complicated, so I won't get into that here. it's like as rational individuals, what are you expecting? If you expect the government to do a certain kind of monetary policy move, can you make better use of it by increasing or decreasing of production even before the government does it? Okay, so that's that. A couple of other things and then we should be done. Fiscal deficit and its role in macroeconomics, again, a term which you hear all the time. Budget deficit, fiscal deficit, government deficit. They're not exactly the same, but the basic idea is very similar. So there are slightly different variations of this idea of deficit for the government, which comes under the umbrella of fiscal deficit. Budget and fiscal deficits are slightly different, but so let me stick to fiscal deficit here. Like any other budget, government budget also has an income and an expenditure side. Broadly speaking, fiscal deficit is a measure of the excess of government spending over income, right? Typically, fiscal deficit is measured as a percentage of GDP, and fiscal austerity, in fact, this is for fiscal there are other terms. Austerity is a term which is used. Fiscal conservatism can be another term. There are several other terms which essentially mean that the government should try to keep the deficit to a certain threshold percentage of GDP and not let it go beyond that percentage. So, just to give you a sense of what are the kind of items which appear under the government budget, just look at these. So like any other budget, right, there is a receipt or income side and an expenditure side. So what are the major income sides for the government? Of course, taxes being the major source of income, right, for the government. Income taxes, indirect taxes like VAT or customs would go into the income side for the government. That's okay. But what we have is, it's another kind of VAT. I mean, the basic principle, we don't call it VAT, but it's another kind of, what is the full? Yeah, but okay. If you don't want VAT, I mean, anyway, I mean, here this is true for the world as a whole, broad categories. Non-tax revenue, dividends, charges, fees, these are basically when the government invests in companies, etc. So, for example, if the government has holdings in corporates and the corporates pay you dividends, the government as part owner will get dividends out of it. So that will be part of government income. Interest received on loans given. The government, of course, has a whole portfolio of loans that it gives out to different economic entities, companies, individuals. The central government might have loans given to state governments, etc., etc. So interest received on loans given. Difference between revenue receipts. Yeah, it will come in there. So this initial, that upper part of this budget accounting is called the current account. It should have come in here, but I couldn't put it in here. On the expenditure side, tax shared with state governments, salaries and all sorts of government spending, interest paid on loans that the government has borrowed, right? So if the government has pending loans from IMF or some of the other international financial organizations and it has to pay interest on that, that goes on under expenditure. Under the capital account, loans repaid by states or PSUs. So this is not interest that you receive, actual principals being repaid by the government, by your creditors. You know, you've given loan to creditors, could be companies, could be it's a state government. They're repaying the loan. Yeah. The principal. Sale of assets. Government has land. Government has other kinds of assets. It sells it and it gets paid. That's the receipt. Loans from the market. That will also come in under receipts here. And on the other hand, you have a certain set of expenditure items. I mean, I'm showing it, I don't expect you to remember each and every item here. The basic idea is to give you a sense of how we can conceptualize the fiscal deficit. Essentially, it's taxes minus government spending, right? Taxes would be the government's income. Broadly, taxes is the main part of the government income. And all sorts of expenditures that the government has to make, paying, IIT professors, paying the janitor who cleans the street on behalf of a government municipality, all these, running a government school, running a government hospital, these would all be part of government expenses, right? Yes. Sorry, this one. Loans from market is, when the government ends up taking new loans. So for example, these are loans repaid by states. These are new loans that the government raises in that given year from the market. No, this government it happens both ways. Here, this is the government taking loans from the market, yes. I think no, but market, I mean, it can also, but if certain countries, if their credit rating with the World Bank or the IMF particularly is not very good, it might have to go to the private market also internationally. So, so you are basically saying that why is it coming under receipts? Because at the point that the market comes in, the loan comes in, the government is in a position to use that money. So it's a part of, it can't be part of the expenditure because the government hasn't spent it as yet. The sort of, what is the right word? The fact that the government owes that loan will come up in future budgets in terms of both the credit, the interest payments that the government will have to make, and eventually the principal that the government will have to pay back. That will be part of the expenditure at that time. You do, but then the point is that, ultimately people will get to know, it's not like government is supposed to just report the final fiscal deficit. One can always unpack the exact elements and say that this is not the real fiscal deficit that we are concerned about, because in terms of its current payments and receipts, the government is in a huge deficit. Yeah. I don't think it typically is a done thing to just to show it, because it's an artificial way of just bringing down the number, because the real fiscal situation remains the same. I do not know for sure exactly what the government's practice in India is, but typically that's not how things are. These kind of goals are met. Because the World Bank or whoever, the credit rating agencies who are kind of looking at you and hoping that, or forcing you, or at least advising you to keep fiscal deficits within a certain level to maintain your credit rating or essentially credit rating, whether it's the World Bank or private players, and they know that this is how you're bringing it down, that wouldn't come out as the real sort of fiscally, a fiscally, what is the responsible economy. So I don't know if in reality there is some gaming that happens at the level of, but that theoretically there is no way of actually, just to reduce the numbers in the final count will have no real economic meaning in my mind. Yes. Sorry, point number 4. Tax shared with government. So the government, the central government is typically the one. Now, of course, GST is given straight away to the states. But in most countries, the central government is the authority in charge of levying taxes and collecting. So you collect the taxes, but part of it needs to go. You can't spend it. It's due to the lower levels of the government, the states or the municipalities or whatever. So you are raising the money, but part of it you immediately give to the other branches, the lower branches of the government. Revenue deficit, surplus difference. How do I define? I think if you just look at this, I'm actually not 100% sure. I think if you look at just the current account, so before getting into the capital account, and you look at income minus expenditure, the deficit that you get is called revenue deficit. Once you add the capital accounts also, it becomes fiscal deficit. I think that's what it is. Fiscal deficit is definitely when you have both receipts and expenditure in the current as well as the and revenue deficit is actually where I'm not sure is what's the difference between revenue deficit and budget deficit. I think there is some simple difference or some minor difference, but the basic idea is the same. It depends on exactly what gets expended within each sort of definition. Yes. No. Typically what it does is it runs a deficit and then it loans, or this is actually called deficit financing. Where the government, in fact let's go back to this part. So is spending more than income a sustainable policy alternative for governments? Firstly, apart from sustainability, you are asking immediately what do they do? If they end up spending more than they have earned, how do they meet? Like as a household or as an individual, you have to somehow meet it, right? Either you will have to reduce your expenditure or increase your income. Government, because they have the exclusive authority of printing money, they have the ability to do what is called deficit financing, which is essentially, nowadays they don't print money anymore. It's through a change in the sort of sale or purchase of government bonds. They raise the extra amount or sell out. Right? If they have a surplus, they just lend it out to other economic agents. If they are on a deficit, they raise that money from the economy through what is called deficit finance. So the government can do it, but that's has to be seen as an immediate relief or an immediate measure to tide over this deficit, right? And this is where the issue comes in, and this is a very politically charged discussion, that most countries in the world run on deficits. Most countries run on deficits, and they run on deficits year after year. So their total sort of the total debt to various agents, other countries, other agents in their own country or internationally keeps increasing. So the question is that how long can this go on, and what is the ultimate economic effect of this kind of piling up of deficit as debt? Yeah, and that happens. And but even on this, there is no universal. Well, of course, nobody says that running a deficit for its own sake is a good idea, right? But some economists would want to make this distinction that the government should not function as a family or as an individual, or need not. It's not like government if it spends, because for an individual, what will you say? Please manage your spending and earning. I mean, manage your financial affairs better so that you don't run a deficit, right? Because you're taking a loan and you owe somebody that money and interest, etc. You can't keep doing it. Now, the dominant neoclassical position is yes, the government essentially should more or less function like any other economic agent. Growing fiscal deficit leads to inflation and more generally into economic instability. The Keynesian position, which is contrarian here, says that if government spending, because of which the government is running this deficit, because of which the government is running this deficit, is used as investment or used for investment and job creation, which in turn will lead to higher GDP and eventually higher taxes in the future periods. You are actually, it's like saying that I am running a deficit at the level of my family to educate my son, rather than to simply buy him new toys. If I'm using it to educate my son, I think it's worth it, because even economically, it might be worth it for all sorts of non-economic reasons. But even economically, he's adding, or I'm able to add, skills, human resources are getting accumulated, and tomorrow his earning capacity is going to go up. Right? But just giving him toys might have other good effects, but I think I don't want to take this analogy too far. But the basic thing is that why are you running the deficit matters according to the Keynesian position. If you are running a deficit to finance more investment, you might actually get a return in the future period, and running a deficit might very well be advisable in those cases. But of course, the neoclassicals are much more conservative, and they would say that no, any kind of deficit should be avoided, especially piling on of deficits year after year has to be avoided at any cost. Yeah, that's true, but then there are all sorts of fiscal deficit creation that happens across the world, right? What is now going on, for example, in the United States is, yes. Yeah. What you call freebies is also, I don't think, what is freebies? Somebody might say, obviously it remains to be, it depends. That's what I'm saying, that if you talk to different people, just the other day there was a newspaper report of how it has basically made women be able to access a labor market which is, they were earlier not in a position to travel one hour on each direction to access certain jobs, which they can now.
That falls under the thing.
Yeah, but the free, so whether you will call it an investment or a simple transfer as consumption, which has no future returns, it depends on, depends on who you are and how you look at different categories of government expenditure. You see, that fine, certain things are well, I think, agreed upon, that if you are building a road, yes, it's by definition investment. But spending money so that women can access public transport better, I think, but some people will say, no, it's just consumption, you're just giving them some money to just increase their consumption. So I think it becomes an intensely political debate is what I'm trying to say. That it's not such a clear, cut and dry distinction about what kind of fiscal deficit is sustainable or advisable to kind of pile up, because it's ultimately beneficial for the future health of the economy, versus those which you are seeing as unsustainable because there are no future returns to those kind of spendings. Yes. Well, current and capital account, the main difference is so current account is the spending and expenditure which the transaction is limited to the current year. So you have sold something to the government and the government has paid. The entire transaction ends, let's say, in 24-25, and that's the end of it. When the government has taken a loan for you, which is typically the property of capital goods being transacted. Basically, the government has taken a loan from you and it will pay back in the next 10 years. So, it has ramifications over time. So, the money has come to the government this year, but the government, that's not the end of the transaction. Yeah. So, that's the broad distinction. That's why it's not current, it's not entirely current. Some part of the transaction is taking place today, but it has future implications. Okay, let me, in the 10 minutes, right. Let me end with this concept and try to quickly tell you how it's very, very relevant for understanding the way an economy is evolving or progressing or not progressing very much. This idea of structural transformation, and I would like you to, there are different dimensions, as you can see. This is a process where sustained economic growth in an economy, in any country, is seen to, or is typically expected to be accompanied by these associated processes. The first is the declining share of agriculture in GDP and employment. This is the main characteristic of structural transformation. There are other correlates or co-variates. So these things happen together very often. Migration from rural to urban and rapid urbanization, rise of modern industrial and service sector. These are all, you can see, when you expect a decline in agriculture in GDP and employment, it is most likely happening because these processes are also happening side by side. The people are moving from rural to urban areas. There is an increase in modern industrial and service sector activities. There's a demographic transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. And the important thing is, and this relates to the main characteristic, and I'll show you some numbers just to make sense of it. At the completion of the transformation process, there is a near equalization of labor productivity in the agricultural and non-agricultural sectors. At this stage, returns from employment become also sufficiently high across all sectors. Now, the main thing is like this. I'll show you the table here. Can you see the numbers, at least roughly? You will obviously have access to this. So you are dividing up the economy into three sectors. The primary sector, which is essentially agriculture, the secondary sector, which is essentially industry, and the tertiary sector, services. And what we are doing is, we are dividing, and this is for India, we are dividing up the total GDP into percentages which are coming from the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary. In the same way, we are dividing up the total working labor force into these three sectors. So, if you want to read, for example, the figure for 1983, the first time point, in 1983, agriculture was contributing more than 40% of national income or GDP, and more than or about 2/3 of the labor force, 66 point some percent, were engaged in agriculture. Right? Now, structural transformation implies that the role of agriculture, the relative weight of agriculture in both the total income or the total output and the total employment comes down. Right? All countries have developed, become, or moved from transition from being poor agrarian economies to richer, industrialized, and eventually service-intensive economies. The last 300 years of economic history is showing this is the pattern that is common. I mean, there might be some countries which didn't have agriculture even to start with, like Singapore is a city-state, so it never had any. So there might be such aberrations, but broadly, this is exactly how countries have developed. And why do we call it development? Because as people move from backward, primitive agricultural sector to more advanced, initially manufacturing or industrial sector, and eventually to even more advanced service sectors. At least that's what was envisaged. You would expect the returns from such employment to go up as well, because more and more people, so the average returns from employment would be going up because people themselves are moving from low productivity, low returns, backward activities to more advanced, high return activities. Now, look at where India has sort of gone into. This is a period of about 30 odd years, 35 years actually. And things don't look very different now. In fact, post-COVID, things have actually started looking even worse than this. But let's look at what the Indian story tells us. So the agriculture's role or weight or its contribution to GDP has fallen sharply. It has come down to less than 15%. But its contribution to total employment has not fallen that sharply. Which essentially means that agriculture is burdened with a lot of low productivity workers. Yeah, this guy's unemployment is essentially, this is a situation where structural transformation is not only incomplete. If you look at it for the last decade or two, it's kind of slowed down, and some people might say it's kind of stopped, it's stunted. A term that has been used by researchers is stunted structural transformation. And that is problematic because agriculture is, as we all know, is where you have the main concentration of poverty, because these are people who are producing only a small part of national output, but there are so many of them who have to have some share of that. So their average returns are much lower than what you get from either the secondary or the tertiary sector. Yeah. The fact remains that, yeah, so the typical, the ideal structural transformation ends at a point where a country like the USA or Australia or Denmark, let's say, just random countries, but the first two being very major agricultural producers, their contribution, that is agriculture's contribution to GDP, is between 2 to 3%. And the proportion or the share of employment in agriculture is also 2 to 3%. I mean, it could be 4, it doesn't change. So basically, agriculture becomes like any other industry. So 97% of GDP is produced outside agriculture by 97% of the labor force. 3% of GDP is produced in agriculture by 3%, which doesn't mean that agriculture is producing less. It's just that the weight has come down because other sectors have grown so fast that even in spite of being major global agricultural producers, the weight of agriculture in the overall economy of Australia or USA is as low as that. Yeah. So this is the kind of transformation that is associated with development. What you have in many countries, including India, the entire South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, most parts of sub-Saharan Africa, is something like this, where there is too much concentration of low productivity workers in agriculture. Why do they rely? And they don't, fine, let them keep their land. Why are they getting their employment there? Why can't they can keep their land, have it, cultivated by somebody or cultivated themselves. Yeah, but why? I understand that. Why? Is it because they're just irrational people, they hold on to their land and they say because they can't get anything elsewhere. So the crisis is not, it's a crisis in agriculture, but the cause is not what happens within agriculture. The crisis is elsewhere, that we're not able to create enough jobs. That takes people, so then they stick to what they have, the only insurance that they have. You don't like it, I understand, but unfortunately that's you can always come up with 5 cases where that's not the case. Some irrational sort of attachment to land, fine, I'm not even asking them to sell off land. What has happened in other developed areas? Land has been rented out to capitalist farmers. They're, one of my, when I just reached the US for my PhD and I was taking a ride in California from somewhere to somewhere, and I see an old single engine plane which is being used for fertilizer spraying on agricultural land. Because it's thousands of hectares. So that's being, 1,000 hectares being run by 5 people probably as an industrial farm. How does that happen? Because people have opportunities of moving out, and people who have decided to stay with agriculture as an industry stay with agriculture. It becomes a division of labor. People have their own skill sets, they have their preferences, etc. So some people stay back and earn or can earn as much as a banker or an engineer. But that is just not a possibility. I mean, whatever. I mean, ideally, historically, it has always been agriculture to industry to services, right? No, in India it has not. India, we have a bulge in the service sector. Well, it's nobody's fault. The fact is, or it's everybody's fault. I mean, the point is that we are not here to assign blames. I'm just talking about what is the situation. But I just want you to know that the source of this problem, although it's located within agriculture, that's where it seems very obviously present, but the source is actually outside agriculture. The fact that we haven't been able to generate well-paying jobs in enough numbers. Better, it's still not anywhere near to that, but it's way ahead of India, and not just in terms of its share of GDP coming down further. I think China's GDP numbers are 9-10%. Their employment share is also higher. It's about, I think, 16-17%. But still, significantly ahead. Okay, let's stop here. And I guess I